Hello, Andy.
Hello, Chris.
Hiya. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast. The reason I invited you was because someone actually recommended you because we were initially connected through X.
Uh-huh.
And someone recommended your book, latest book, well, book, which is here, The Life Inside. So I
Mm.
bought it, read it, thoroughly enjoyed it,
Uh-huh.
and a very interesting take actually on prison and combining prison with philosophy. So I really enjoyed it. I want to talk to you about that book. Just quickly, like basically,
Mm.
what made you decide to write a book in the first place? Have you written one before, or what made you decide to write this particular book?
I wrote it by accident, in a way. I was trying to make it as a fiction writer, submitting short stories everywhere and collecting rejections. And then on rejection 100 or so, someone said to me, "We saw in your bio that you teach philosophy in prisons. Write us a piece about that." Which I at first didn't want to do because that was just my job. And I thought it was going to be boring to write about your job, and to be a writer you have to write about interesting things.
Yeah,
But actually, once I started writing it, I found there was a lot of energy in the writing and a lot of ideas and images, and I couldn't stop. And I went way over my word count. That was partly because the world I'm writing about in prison is very rich with story, especially once you take philosophy in there, and also this personal background of my having my dad in prison and my brother and my uncle kind of meant that all those elements kind of triangulated into something bigger than I expected them to be. So it wasn't intentional to write the book, actually.
okay. So before we get into the part about where you're going to prisons, what attracted you to philosophy in the first place?
I think it was one of the only subjects that would put up with me, really, because um, I had a kind of complex personality in childhood and teenage years, as you can probably imagine. But in a philosophy room, arguing with the teacher and telling him he's wrong about everything, or being oppositional, or just being at odds with the world, just being kind of deeply alienated and not understanding anything and not accepting anything. It's kind of like that can all be channeled in great directions in philosophy, where it was sort of getting me thrown out of other classrooms. Um, I was very lucky to have a teacher who saw my potential rather than where I was at that time, which was not a great performance academically, not super engaged or organized or anything like that, but gave a lot of extra energy into sort of helping me achieve those things. So,
Yeah. With philosophy, because I remember years ago, I've never learned it as a subject. You only pick up bits and pieces off from your book and elsewhere, but literature. But I remember someone years ago, because I did a degree at Open University, someone saying, after speaking to me, actually, Chris, you'd be good at philosophy. And I thought, there's some interest in there, but I often thought it might be a bit, not just too dry, but almost, it sounds weird, there's almost too much philosophy at times. It can almost play on your
mm.
brain too much. Did you find that initially when you went into philosophy, that was a case, or is just something that you delved into, enjoyed it from the off?
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed it, but it's all of life's big questions coming at you all the time, and I think there is a risk in that it just becomes an intellectual exercise, and a lot of academic philosophy is kind of almost treating big existential questions as if they're kind of parlor games sometimes. What I noticed is, so I did an A level in philosophy and then I did a degree, and um, it's like the years that have followed that and the life events and the geopolitical events and cultural events have all kind of, it's like I've got this bank of images and ideas now to kind of understand uh the world. So it was almost like at the time it was a bit too much or a bit too shallow kind of during the education period, but afterwards it's given me a frame, I suppose, to kind of understand the world and understand prisons, as I try and do in the book.
So how did you get from there, learning about philosophy, to actually not just teaching it, but specifically teaching it in prison? Why was it that attracted you to that role?
I was teaching children, philosophy to children for a while, which is a really fun job. And I did that for about 10 years or so. I still do it occasionally. Um, and you know, the idea in that kind of movement is that philosophy is kind of universally important, that these questions are kind of evocative and important to everyone. Questions about whether it's more important to be mentally free or physically free, whether you're the same person you were yesterday or 10 years ago, whether um, we're always responsible for our actions or not. Um, and I think that kind of philosophy of children movement takes all the essence of philosophy, and it makes it immediate through using stories and using questions that get people to do philosophy. So borrowing a lot from that kind of learning, I then got in touch with a wonderful guy called Mike Coxhead, who was an academic at King's doing a PhD, who really wanted to go into prisons. And so we kind of did it together, and um, had other collaborators along the way as well. So I always knew that because education had changed my life so dramatically, being a teacher felt very meaningful in that sense. And then because I've been visiting prisons from a young age, teaching in prisons, I think also felt quite meaningful for me as well.
So, what was it like when you first went in there? In fact, no, let's go back a bit. You talked about it in the book a very interesting life growing up, because was it your father, your brother, and your uncle that all spent time
Yeah,
behind bars?
yeah.
So, growing up, what was that environment like? Was it some? Because it seems, maybe I'm misreading the book, but it seems to me almost an everyday thing where for, oh, okay, something that you just get used to or inert to. Was it that case, or just how did you feel about that growing up?
So how did I feel about
Yeah, those
my
relatives
brother
going
being
to prison.
inside and things? Well, it was mixed. It was mixed. So with my brother, he's 13 years older than me, and I really admired him the way that little brothers do admire big brothers. So to lose him like that um, was always really painful. And to know that he was somewhere, dangerous and violent, and but to be powerless about that, all of that going on within a child's mind and imagination was all very sad. My dad, I haven't seen since I was 12, and I was really quite relieved when he went away. It was sort of, I think prisons are ultimately very harmful and do a very bad job of bettering society or giving people the chance for moral growth or education or anything like that. But I do recognize there is a protective function, and that partly comes through the fact that my dad went away, and that gave me some kind of headroom. So I've got very mixed feelings about it. Different family members come with different kind of stories about prison for me.
Just going on to that point you made about your dad, and there's a sense of relief. Why was that relief? Was it obviously, I imagine, because of the way he treated you, and I imagine your own mother as well?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this a bit in the book, but I just found him quite scary, quite threatening, unapproachable, unpredictable, like all of that stuff. So yeah, he went away when I was 12, and then it felt like life kind of changed a bit for me. Things felt a bit more possible or something. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, was he? Imagine he's someone then who would, if you try to achieve, he would almost do it down, as almost to keep you grounded, almost. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know because my memories of him are from so long ago and from such a perspective that this is one of the things I was trying to figure out writing the book, is kind of how objective is my story about him here. But um, yeah, he wasn't nurturing as a father, and I imagine there are men out there who sometimes feel undermined by their children's
mm.
happiness or success or whatever, and they can take issue with it, like you're saying. Yeah.
Some of the there's a few comedic points, almost darkly comedic points in the book, and some of them actually involve your uncle
Yeah.
and some of the stories he tells, because you're reading and thinking, you've committed a crime, obviously you deserve to go away for what you've done, but the way he tells it, he seems a very good raconteur. Your
Yeah.
uncle, in a way, does it, and he seems very darkly comedic. Would that be an accurate description of him?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my brother doesn't really talk to me very much about his time in prison because he's my big brother and probably wants to protect me, and it's all, the details of the story are often quite gruesome and scary. But my uncle he's very shameless, and kind of that's how he survived it almost. Some people survive it by working out, getting big muscles, becoming very physically disciplined, very organized. Some people survive prison by reading a lot. Some people survive prison by getting drugs on the landing and getting high off the head. I think the way he survived it was turning it into a story that was funny and had a punchline. And I suppose even though there's a big gap between me and him culturally, I really connected with that in him, this idea that for me as a writer that when I'm going through something really bad, when something really catastrophic happens in life, there is this part of me inside that goes, it's okay, one day you'll be able to write about this, and that will kind of render something from it that will kind of make it survivable. And I think that was the same for him. I mean, he didn't use a pen very much. He could barely read or write, but he knew the cadence and the rhythm of a good joke, and he knew he had great delivery, and he was compelling.
Yeah, he almost seems like he's someone who, if he had the, I imagine he probably have the skill to develop it. He could almost be a comedian, just describing some of his
Yeah,
things. Like I say, he seemed to have that cadence, that raconteur nature of actually being willing to tell stories. I'm surprised no
yeah.
one actually encouraged him to do that, to be honest.
Well, I was glad that comes across in the book because that was the one character I felt like I've got to make him jump off the page, and hopefully he does because otherwise it's an injustice.
So you talk about, well, first of all, the first day you went into a prison. What was it like, actually, your thoughts and going through that? Um, Was it nervousness? Was it anxiety? Or how did you feel? I think I've got to teach prisons philosophy here.
Yeah, yeah, very nervous. The first prison I taught was Belmarsh, so it was high security, and before you even get to the kind of confinement area, you're going through security and stuff. There's Alsatians and there's airport style scanners, and you're getting kind of frisked, and the security officers, they don't smile at you, and um, it's a serious operation, and so for me, it was I think it's intimidating for anyone. It's designed to be intimidating, of course. That's prisons are they don't look the way they look by accident. I suppose for me it did have this association of trying to understand a bit what my brother or uncle or dad had been through. I mean, my first time in prison, actually, I think I was kind of what do they call it? The bigotry of low expectations,
Oh,
like
yeah, yeah.
where my family, the education levels varies across my family. In terms academic education can be quite low, although people have kind of passions and preoccupations and interests. But I was kind of trying to simplify my material in my class as much as possible, thinking, got to make it accessible, got to make it accessible. But every prisoner is different, and every prison is different, and the kinds of people you meet in Belmarsh, people who are in the real deep end of the system, doing tens and twenties kind of in terms of sentences. Some of them are really smart. Some of them came in really smart, and some of them got really smart inside. They did a lot of reading, they did studies and things like that. So actually, the adjustment for me was like, not every prisoner I meet is going to be like my dad. They're going to have so many different profiles. You have to take every individual as they come. That's a good rule of teaching generally, but
Mm.
it's even me with my kind of quite substantial like family experience, even I had to learn that. So keeps you humble. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that comes across in the book when you go to the extracts of like different classes you've taught is, like you say, you somehow academically are very smart, but even ones who aren't very well read academically, they still have what I would call the street smarts. they still have the and like you see, like you'll say a philosophical tale or story,
Yeah.
and number of times they would relate it to prison and their own life. I mean, it was just extraordinary. They seem to be very smart in that sense as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, if a philosophical question is interesting, it's interesting in any room that you're in, whether that room is in a university, whether it's in a prison. Questions about whether it's more important to be mentally free or physically free. Well, there's guys I was talking to who were banged up 23 hours a day, and they were telling me that they felt more free in prison than they did out of prison. So instantly you're like, wow, tell me more about that. I want to know, I want to try and understand what these philosophical ideas mean in this world and according to this logic. And yeah, it was always having to kind of rethink my first assumptions about stuff, which as a philosopher is kind of what you seek, right? You're always trying to keep in touch with that.
Mm. Was there a matter of was there some trust that had to be established initially between you and the prisoners before they started to warm to you, actually engage in the lessons that you were teaching?
Yeah, trust is a really interesting thing. I mean, I can't quite remember my first class. But I've done many courses across many prisons, and so I've had many introductions and many first encounters, and trust is a thing. Some people have been very low on trust, and perhaps you can understand why. Often people come from backgrounds in prison that are very traumatic, very difficult, where perhaps their trust has been broken. So you being around and building a relationship with them as a teacher and kind of having a bond with them maybe is risky for them. A lot of people don't trust education. A lot of people have been excluded, or their connection to their memories of education, their association with education is like shame and humiliation, being told off, being put in detention. So that's kind of in the room when you're building trust. And aside from that, the institution is sometimes untrustworthy. It's unreliable. They're told they're going to get let out and then they get banged up. It's very chaotic. So what I would say is I started in 2016. In 2022, my book came out, and I never before that told prisoners about my background. Partly because I just thought, well, why would I be doing that really? Is it because I'm trying to ingratiate myself to them and say, sort of hand wringing, like, oh, I understand what you're going through, because I don't. And um, I've never been behind the door, and that's just a fact of where my knowledge ends. Um, but since the book's come out, obviously I can't hide that background anymore, and I've often got kind of people at the back of the room kind of reading my book as I'm trying to teach them and kind of looking up at me. And the anthropological lens has turned around now, because I was saying, uh, you know, now my prisoners in my class will be talking about free will and determinism or something, and they'll say to me, "Oh yeah, it's a bit like you and your brother, when this happened or when that happened." I've got these details from my life, so that that has kind of built trust, having the book out and having my story there, and they're a bit more like, I know who you are, and everything. But yeah, sometimes trust is low, and trust between people in the room is low as well, depending on what room you're in. Um, yeah.
Have you had any awkward moments with the prisoners in regards to your book? Say if I don't like anything about how you describe not just them but the prison system. Has been anyone awkward come up? Actually, I don't like this, and you thought, oh, what's going to happen here?
Yeah, I've had a few prisoners say, I didn't find that bit believable or that bit believable. And there's often some disagreement in the room about that. But, you know, um, often if people say that, I just say, oh, thanks for flagging that, or thanks for bringing that up. Like, that's something to think about if I'm going to write about prison again, because you do want it to connect with. You don't want it to just be pure anthropology. You do want it to connect. Whenever I get criticism like that, I take it seriously. I also remember it's just one person's opinion. But a book is never finished, that it's just abandoned. and then you have to move on in life. But the words on these pages in my book, they would be different if I wrote them today, as an older, hopefully wiser person with, who sees things a bit differently to how I did 4 years ago or whatever.
Mm. How's the prison system changed since you started going into prisons? Has it changed at all? Has it got better? Has it got worse?
I think it's got better and it's got worse.
Mm,
I mean, there's a scene in the book in 1993 where I'm visiting my brother in prison, and then we move forward 30 years to when I'm in prison. And in those 30 years, the prison population doubled. Now, the population in the UK didn't double, but the prison
mm,
population did. More things were criminalized, longer sentences were given out, etc., etc. We know that it's seriously overcrowded now, and that's why the new government are giving people early release, etc. Um, so a prison system that is just keeps overflowing by definition isn't improving if you think the job of prison is to rehabilitate, etc. So it's a kind of simple answer in that sense. I do meet a lot of people in prison who work in prison, other teachers, staff, officers, governors, or whatever, and they are kind of humanitarian, um, kind of in their sensibility. They recognize the effect that prison will have on someone's mental health. They recognize the reason that people come into prison. It's not like all the officers are kind of baddies in a pantomime with kind of eager for kind of sadism. It's a lot of the people in there, I think, um, want to change things.
mhm.
Changing the system is very, very hard, and a lot of that goes to politics and how politically it's just so unpopular to have kind of progressive prison policies. It's popular to punish. It's popular to punish in times of instability. We've had a lot of political, economic instability, pandemic instability. Often the way a government can show it's in control is by just punishing people, banging them up, serving justice, and people's appetite for a more complex justice system, more humane one, kind of dims a little bit.
What's the most memorable feedback you've had from prisoners regarding how they view your class? Whether and that could be either good or bad.
Yeah, there's one thing I talk about in the book where there's just a guy who he's been in prison at this point for over 15 years. He's very withdrawn. If you're living in prison for that long, you see a lot of people come and go, a lot of churn. You've had a lot of broken promises. You're very isolated, and so he was kind of like in his own kind of mental cell within the prison almost. Didn't really engage with people. Kind of had his books, had his workout in the gym, had his routine. But when he came, he got really involved and in the sessions, and that was really heartening. And he wrote a little note, just said 2 hour holiday, and he left it on my desk. He said thank you, and he left. And a 2 hour holiday in prison is kind of how you kind of describe a visit, or something like slang for a visit. Your family, your children, your mum or whatever come and visit you, and for those 2 hours you're not in prison, you're on holiday, you're somewhere else. And I think it was that note and moments like that that made me think, oh, I know what my value is here now as a teacher. I'm not going to turn the system around.
Mm.
um, and I'm not really even rehabilitating people. I think that gets very complex when we talk about rehabilitating people anyway. Um, but what I am doing is maybe offering a 2 hour holiday, which feels very small, but I can work with that. And I know it's something, you know, people can get something from. So that means something.
Bearing in mind that you have to do lesson preparation, obviously, before you go into prisons, and given the nature of the environment that you teach in, how easy is it to switch off, or more accurately, how is it to separate your personal and professional life?
Much easier than it was. Yeah, I mean, at first, for the first few years, I think there was like, I remember like just leaving. Say I was working in Brixton Prison. Come out of Brixton Prison, you walk down Brixton Hill towards the centre, and it's a lot going on that hill. Like it's a lot for the senses, a lot of like just cars and cafes and space and parks and smells, and it's so to come out of a space that's so kind of dark and deprived into a
Mm,
space where you can do any, you can go and spend money, you can get on a train, you can travel, so like just just that freedom, I think, and like that material freedom and that freedom to move and that ability to see the sky like unframed by the prison walls. Like I never that was always quite euphoric.
mm,
And I think part of that is sort of a kind of vicariousness I have about my brother's experience and him being inside and kind of maybe reliving that a bit, the coming out of that a bit on his behalf or something. Um, it's not like I've been in prison, I don't feel that, but when I come out of it, I really just the details of things, the color, the line and the shape are like just that bit more crisp and high definition.
yeah, yeah. There's something you describe in the book, and I forget what you call it, but it's almost like this. It's either split personality, almost like this devil on your shoulder, where you do something wrong, and then that side of the brain basically worries about it a lot. Can you just go into detail about what you call that, and also that, why you have that with you?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, there's this kind of psychological enemy called the executioner,
Mm,
and it's a kind of intrusive thought of kind of guilt, dread, shame. It's very obscure. It's a feeling that I've done something wrong or I'm about to do something wrong, and it's catastrophic. It's final. It's the law, and it's coming for you. Um, it's very Kafkaesque. That novel by Kafka, The Trial, where he just wakes up and he's told he has to go to his trial, and he's not told what it's for or what he's done wrong, but he complies, and just this horrible kind of autocratic voice in the head. Um, in the book, I trace it to a kind of sins of the father, kind of shame, like a kind of inherited guilt, which is basically the feeling of I don't want to be like my dad. And as I understand it, it's not just me who has that feeling. Like I had a dad who was particularly unpleasant, but um, and I don't want to be like him. I don't want to be a criminal like him. I don't want to do the kind of harm he did. But I understand that even if your dad was an English literature teacher, or even if your dad was like, something very plain or respectable, people just have this instinct growing up of like, I don't want to be like my dad, I want to be my own man and whatever. So for me, that I don't want to be like my dad just had this particularly kind of loaded, quite what felt to me very kind of high stakes fear and dread around it growing up. The book charts those feelings and a feeling toward recovery. Um, I'm happy to say that the last 2.5 years or so, I've had very little in the way of that type of thinking. When I was younger, or I've had two episodes in my life where it's manifested as a kind of OCD, OCD, this feeling of like something bad is going to happen unless I've switched the oven off or the iron or the taps or the light switches or whatever, there's trying to stave off the catastrophe. Um, Thankfully, that seems to have passed, though. I seem to be in a period of reprieve, and it's nice to be there. I don't take it for granted.
The way you describe that feeling in the book, and you don't use this metaphor for it, but it almost sounds very like like a Catholic guilt almost, and a shame for something which you didn't have control over, i.e., your sibling, your relatives going into prison. I just wonder why would it have lasted that long, especially going into the prisons and seeing how prisoners live, and knowing that not all prisoners are the same, as we discussed a little bit earlier. What was it that in the end that A continued it for many years and B finally switched it off almost?
Yeah, it's interesting you say Catholic shame. I'm not religious. I was never christened or baptized or anything, but I did go to a Catholic secondary school just because it was the nearest school to my house. I wonder if that imagery kind of got in there as well for me. Um, I think part of the reason it took such deep root for me was perhaps this feeling I had as a kid of like being a bit of the kind of golden child in the family, like the child who was going to break the cycle. And that part of that opportunity and part of that challenge was like, well, what if I don't? You know, what if I'm like my dad, and what if I let everyone down and whatever? So it was partly a kind of emotional pressure. The things that cured it were many things really. I think getting to grips with it, just articulating it, which I did in the book to some degree. Um, Therapy, it's really, really good. Kind of understanding the causes, understanding the triggers. I don't call it OCD in the book, and I don't call it intrusive thoughts. I don't use the words like trauma actually to describe my own experience at all, because I think that kind of puts it in a mental health category. Whereas the term executioner, I've always had this image in my head of an executioner, like someone who kills life. And then executioners are, they work for the justice system, you know. So within the world of the story, I wanted it to just be the executioner. But in my private life, I do recognize it's a mental health condition and I've treated it as such. So therapy's been very useful. Just things like, you know, running, like if you have anxiety, like doing exercise like 3, 4 times a week, getting enough sleep, making sure your diet isn't just like caffeine and sugar, you know, like I really, once I wrote the book, I went on a quite sort of deep 2 years or so of just like, I just got to look after myself, you know, like I've got to get my house in order. And I'm pleased to say I've had the opportunity to do that. And yeah, it's been a privilege to be able to get well.
There's one section in the book where you describe it, where it comes across to you in prison involving a mobile phone.
Mm,
I want to go into that because I imagine that would be a worrying time without going through what you're going through. But then that on top of that, that must have been horrendous. I mean, you were fortunate in one sense because it was the last 10 minutes of the lesson.
yeah.
So, although it must have been the longest 10 minutes of your life at that point.
Yeah, so you're not allowed mobile phones in prison. If you are found with a phone on you in prison, it can be a very serious offense. You know, it's a sackable offense in many prisons, and sometimes worse, you know, especially if you're believed to be um, selling them to prisoners or whatever. And when you go through security, you see faces of like ex-prison officers who were bringing in phones, drugs, tobacco, any kind of contraband to sell to prisoners. And I was kind of went through a period of being neurotically obsessed with making sure my phone wasn't in my pocket and putting it in a locker and like, you know, just like pressing it into my hand to make sure that like I could really feel it in my hand, that it was in my locker. And that's the thing about that kind of deeply irrational guilt OCD stuff, is it's immune to evidence, because there's always this like, what if you're just imagining this, what if. um and anyway, as is a kind of classic thing with OCD, you become so preoccupied with making the mistake that eventually you do make the mistake because your mind is all over the place. And
Yeah.
there's a moment in the book where I took a phone into prison and thankfully just walked out. But the walking out was a kind of reprieve in a way. It was a weird turning moment of like having done the thing that I really, really didn't want to do. I then did it, but that kind of became a small turning point. in the desire to just leave that kind of madness behind.
What is, and you can probably answer this inside or outside of prison, but what is the purpose of philosophy? Obviously, with philosophy, you're questioning a lot about the world, but just in general terms, I don't mean that in the sense of, oh, you get a philosophy degree and you use that to get some sort of job, because I know a lot of education is based around employment, has been for like last 25 years. But just in general, like what is the purpose of philosophy in the outside world?
Yeah, I mean, people will say it's about the pursuit of truth. Uh, and, part of living a good life or a virtuous life is having a kind of philosophical wisdom. There's so many answers, and there's kind of two ways I could answer it. One is as the kind of company man, I'm Mr. Philosophy, and this is what philosophy can give you. Um, and there's kind of the personal kind of reason, why am I so interested in this and why do I do this in prisons? I just think it's a really good way of getting to know someone.
Mm.
If I say to you, what do you think matters more in life, luck or choices? Like, why do you think we are where we are in our lives, or the rich people or poor people are where they are in their life because of luck or because of choices? That's just going to be an interesting discussion. I'm probably going to learn a lot about you in that discussion. I'm probably going to reveal a lot about myself to you in that discussion. And it also gives people an opportunity to be complex because I've got like 7 different answers to that question in my head. And, the thing about being in prison and the stigma of that and the shame of the kind of convict label is you're just one thing now, you're just a criminal. And a lot of things are interpreted through that. Oh, well, he's a criminal. You would think that, you would say that. And philosophy kind of gives you the right to be complex again. So I'm interested in it because I like having interesting conversations. I'm not
Mhm.
sure if it gets us closer to the truth, philosophy. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Um, I'm so I wouldn't answer it as the company man. I'd answer it as just kind of my own personal idiosyncratic use for it.
So one of the things you said there about choice and luck, and I think that's in the book as well, where we discussed that. Has that made, when you've done a session like that with the prisoners, has that made the prisoners almost step back and think, oh, I don't really want to answer this because you talked about philosophy as a pursuit of truth. That is very truthful. Because if you said luck or choices and they say, and they realize it's choices, for example, that's going to reveal a lot about themselves that they don't necessarily want to reveal. So how have prisoners responded to a session like that?
Um, that one, uh, I mean, I have a dialogue in the book between me and a prisoner, and I've kind of entered the debate, which I don't normally do in my classes, and I don't normally do in the book, but here I have, because luck is such a preoccupation of mine. My brother went to prison 12 times, and I've only ever been in prison with a keychain on my belt. We're so close, we're brothers, we're kin, but there's this like wildly different outcome, and it's like, wow, like I really feel the randomness of the universe so much sometimes.
Mm.
But is it randomness? That's the whole question. Um, so I'm kind of saying to this prisoner in the book, like, look, luck is kind of always a little bit present, maybe. And what he's saying to me is, it's all about merit. It's all about choices. You make stupid choices, then stupid things, bad things will happen. You make good choices, good things will happen. And he's talking about that in relation to his own kind of entanglement with kind of street crime and hard drugs like heroin. That he chose to take it. He's got to choose to give it up. He's chose to be an absent father. He's got to choose to be a present one. And this is something I notice as a kind of habit, or as a kind of trope in prison, is a lot of people assuming kind of responsibility in this very absolute way. And you know, you watch The Shawshank Redemption, everyone in that film is saying that they're innocent, really, and it wasn't really them. Actually, my experience of prison is much more in the towards the other direction, where a lot of people are saying, "It's me, it's my fault." I'm the only one who can change it, and I'm going to do it. And I've got mixed feelings about that because I think it's sometimes unhelpful, and like it's almost like a trope of like one of the unhelpful things we do as men, like in like masculinity, is like I can control everything. Don't worry, I've got it all under control. It's like actually maybe you do need to understand the ways in which you've been conditioned or influenced or whatever before you can kind of move forward here. So yeah, that's how it went in that conversation. It's always a fascinating conversation, that one.
So talk about control. Would you say that a lot of them would be about choices because not just because it's what they feel, but also it's a real sense of control they have in prison, in the sense of you're told when to go to sleep, when to eat, when to go to classes, etc., etc. And you have to have that mindset almost of, well, especially I think if it's a short sentence of right, this is what I can control and this is what I am going to control, because otherwise you're just going to lose hope when in prison.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about Stoics and Epictetus in one chapter in the book, and there's a guy, Wallace, who's a long-term prisoner, who has found those little things in his life that he can control. So officers come round just after 5 o'clock and they'll bang you up, lock your door for the night. He'll close his door a few minutes before the officer gets the chance to. Um, if you're talking on the phone on the landing, officers will give you a 2-minute warning. You'll have to hang up in 2 minutes. He times it so that he hangs up before the officer tells him that he'll
Yeah.
have to hang up in 2 minutes. And, if you're in an environment like prison where you're so infantilized, where you're told you've got to change, otherwise they can't let you out sometimes, if you're an IPP prison or whatever, you've got to change. And yet we don't actually give you the opportunities to do that because you're so infantilized, you've lost so much autonomy. Then I can see why closing your door a few minutes early feels like, like I'm taking control, I'm making a choice. I can see why you would seek those opportunities to just hold on to your own identity in some way.
Would you write another book about prison life, not necessarily or even philosophy?
Yeah, I probably will. I am writing something at the moment, and prison features quite a lot in it. Uh,
Is that fiction or non-fiction?
it's fiction. Yeah, yeah. It's inspired by true events, but it's fiction. Yeah. So I feel like we're in a different prison though in this project. Like I said at the beginning, there's no such thing as the prison. There are only different prisons. Um, and one thing I've done since publishing the book is teach at a therapeutic prison, which is just a really different universe and creates a whole different mood of hope and anticipation, but also with hope comes a kind of jeopardy. Um, so yeah, I've got a lot of things to think about in terms of that.
We're nearly towards the end now. If people want to find out about your work, both in terms of where they can get the book and what you're doing philosophy-wise and your next book, where can they go to?
So the book's called The Life Inside, a memoir of prison, family, and learning to be free. Available from all bookshops, good and bad. And I'm on X as Andy W Philosophy. I know X is kind of becoming a bit quieter than it was, and a lot of people are leaving. I don't know if I'm going to go to Blue Sky, but I'm around there anyway for now.
Okay, cool. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Real pleasure. I'll leave the details of where you can get your book in the description below. Andy West, thank you for so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Your questions, were really kind of, you'd really got into the book. I could tell from the questions you were asking. That's always such a like, oh, you read my book. Thank you so much. That's very sweet of you. So thanks.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much.